This is Woodwork for Humans, the series where we make great things out of wood, and sometimes we even make our own tools. Recently, we've been doing a lot of joinery, like the dovetails on this simple wooden gift box. But there are a lot of other great joints out there besides the dovetail. For instance, consider the humble rabbet, or rebate for our friends across the pond. This is just a little shelf cut into the edge or end of a piece of wood. And then that shelf allows us to accept another piece of wood just like that. And then the two pieces are typically reinforced with either fasteners, glue, or both. The rabbet is a simple and effective joint, and you find it on things like drawers, boxes, and cabinetry, all stuff that we might want to build. But no matter how you're going to make a rabbet, you probably need a rabbet plane. You can grab one of these vintage or new metallic ones, and these are great. They have all sorts of fences and depth stops and all sorts of stuff, but they're a little bit pricey and they can be difficult to find. So instead of going that route, how about we do this? How about we make our own for $0? Seriously. And this plane has two huge advantages. The first thing is that it's made out of a laminated construction. It's glued together from several different pieces of wood. This means we can make it in several pieces, and if any of those individual parts go wrong, we can just throw it away and remake it, instead of ruining the whole thing. The second big advantage of this plane is that all you need to build it is a common bench chisel and a couple of scraps of solid wood. And let's be honest, if you don't have a chisel and a couple of scraps of wood, then you have, wasted your life. I'm going to start this plane by cross-cutting my stock. I'm going to use a vintage rabbet plane and base all of my measurements off of that. But all the measurements you need are in the plans and on the tip sheet, so you're not going to need your own plane to work from. The main body of my plane is going to be made out of cherry. And whatever piece you use just needs to be a little bit thicker than whatever chisel you're going to use. You're also going to need a backer board. I'm using a piece of soft maple here, and it's on the thin-ish side. This piece is a little over ½ inch. You can kind of use whatever is sitting around. Once I've got my boards cross-cut, I'm also going to have to rip my cherry board to the correct width. I'm just standing on it and ripping it with my Ryoba saw. That's a really fast way of getting the cut done. I'm also going to dress the wood flat and square using the palm in my vise and a standard bench plane. Precision matters a lot in tool making, so I'm going to shoot the ends of all of my stock on a shooting board and make both of my pieces as perfect as I can be. I want the main body to eventually end up the exact width of my chisel. So I'm going to set a marking gauge to my chisel, scribe all the way around my cherry board, and then plane it down to that line so I have the finished thickness. You can see how the two pieces will fit together. And while I've got them together, I'm going to mark the outside and the front of each piece. That's going to allow me to keep them straight during assembly. I'm going to get the bed angle off my vintage plane, and it's 47 degrees. Now the other angles are going to be different for you depending on your chisel and how thick it is. But for me, my wedge is 12 degrees. My escapement is 63 degrees, and the chisel width makes up the difference. Now I've got to cut out all of these angles. And for this project, I need to saw very, very accurately. So I'm going to use the knife wall technique. I'll cut lines with my marking knife, using my protractor as the straight edge. I'm going to make several strokes on each line for a deep and crisp cut. Then I'll take my widest chisel and push in towards that line, bevel up, and flick out the chips. This is going to give me a shallow trench that's going to guide my saw really precisely through all the cuts I have to make. With my Japanese pull saw, I always do careful cuts as a series of triangles. First, I cut across the top and down one face. Then I flip the board and cut down the other face. Then I flip the board over and make the same cuts across the bottom. Now all I have is the waste in the middle of the board, and the cuts at the top and the bottom edges will guide my saw. You can see that for my bed, I have a nice clean cut, and I'm going to repeat that process to cut my escapement. Of course, even good saw cuts require some cleanup, so I'm going to plane these edges flat and square in the vise. One of my pieces comes out a little bit bellied, so I'm going to shoot that straight just by holding it steady on the shooting board. This freehand technique doesn't always work, but it works this time. I also want to plane in a little bit of angle in my escapement. I want this angle here not to be a straight 90 degrees, but to angle up and into the plane a little bit. That way, when I add the wedge and tap it in, that angle is going to pull the wedge not just down, but also into the plane. It's going to make it hold the chisel really securely. To get this angle on my escapement face, I'm just going to shim the board up a tiny bit with cardboard and then shoot it. That's going to give me a degree or two of incline. It's all I need to make this work perfectly. Now my bed and escapement are done, and I need to finish my backer board and my wedge. I'll lay my bed pieces on my escapement and trace the angles. I can then copy these angles onto my wedge stock, which is just the cherry piece left over from ripping the main body. I'll rip down this angled cut, and then glue up the body and let those pieces cure while I eat lunch. Then I'll pull off the clamps and test the wedge fit. Man, I got super lucky. It is a great fit right off the saw. Now I'm going to add the chisel, and the handle of the chisel interferes with the wedge. So I'll cut out some material and then chisel and sand the curves nice and smooth. Now the chisel fits in here nicely. Now at this point in the video, you might have noticed that I started out using this chisel and ended up using this one. Here's what happened. This chisel, which is a nice vintage one, is a socket chisel. And the blade of a socket chisel actually slopes up on the top to where it starts to form the socket. Now, usually this is good. It makes the chisel really sturdy. And I knew this feature was there, but I wasn't really thinking about it. And having a curved face like this is going to make it very, very difficult for this chisel to seat in the plane body. It's going to want to pop out all the time because it's just the wrong shape. On the other hand, this Irwin Marples chisel here, it has a flat, straight blade. It's flat on both edges, so I can use this surface against the bed of my plane, and it's not going to want to move on me at all. These blue tip chisels are also totally decent bench chisels. I will link to a set of them down in the description. Now that I've switched chisels, my wedge unfortunately no longer fits, and it's going to take me a lot of time fiddling with it very carefully to get the perfect fit that I need on the face of the wedge and that internal angle on the escapement. I do several test fits while getting it slowly closer, but still not close enough. So I finally hold the plane and pull the wedge down the sole of the plane for added control. This gets me very close, and then just a little bit of sanding on the flat of my bench helps me dial in that wedge all the way. Now I've got a perfect fit all the way along the side of the wedge and in that angle I cut in the escapement. I don't need to do anything else to it. Finally, I need a little cutaway in the wedge that's going to allow chips to escape, and I want to put a nice little finial on the top. This is mostly for looks. I'll cut these details with a chisel and a bench hook, and then I'll install the chisel and the wedge, and I'm ready to test. Even before it's done, this plane produces a lovely little shaving. I can already tell that it's going to work great. So this plane functions, but it's very uncomfortable, mostly because of all the sharp corners and 90-degree angles on it. So I'm going to trace a radius onto the corners using this big fender washer, and then chisel off the waist with bevel-up cuts. Then I can sand it smooth. Now on this vintage plane, you can see that the chamfers not only go across the top like this, but they also carry around the front and back of the chisel, and they end in these lovely little stopped chamfer details. These are not necessary, but they're super cool, and I've got to have them on my plane. To make the stopped chamfers, I'll make little saw cuts in the edges of the plane, chisel down to them from the top, and then scoop up with small bevel-up cuts to form the stops on the front and back of the plane. When all this stuff is done, the body and wedge of the plane are pretty much done. What I need now is a fence that's going to let me control the width of my rabbets. So I'll cut a piece of thin, hardwood stock and drill and chisel slots in both ends. When I go to install this into the bottom of my plane, I'm going to use several small washers as spacers between the fence and the plane. This is going to keep the fence from interfering with the chisel. It's going to let the edge of the chisel come down below the sole of the plane a little bit so it can cut effectively. Once I've got the fence screwed into the body of the plane with the spacers, I'm ready to test it. Now that our rabbet plane is complete, we need to learn how to set it up and use it. First thing you want to do is grab it over the top with your thumb across the iron and the wedge, just like this. That's going to keep them from falling out when you strike the back of the plane. Just like that. One sharp tap, and everything should come out really easily. Set the plane aside for a second and check out your chisel. First thing you need to do is make sure that it's absolutely square across the top. Wooden square is perfect for this because it won't blunt the edge. And then, if you've been using the chisel a little bit recently, go ahead and hone it up right now. A razor sharp chisel is totally helpful for this tool. Now we're ready to reassemble the tool. So, grab the plane, insert the iron in, put it so it's just above the fence, add the wedge on top. I'm keeping my thumb across the wedge and the iron, and I'm going to give the wedge one good sharp whack. Now everything's nice and set up, and it's not going anywhere. Next thing I want to do is set up my fence so that I'm getting the correct width rabbet when I cut with the plane. Now, you can measure this or use a square for it. Those work great, but what I really like to do is just set up my fence from a piece of stock that I'm going to be using. So let's just say, for instance, that I was making a cabinet and I was going to use a piece of material this thickness for the back of the cabinet, and I want to rabbet this into the sides. Well, instead of measuring, I'm just going to use a scrap of that stock to set up my fence. It's really easy. I'll just take a screwdriver and I'll gently loosen both of the screws that hold my fence in place. Then I'll set my piece of scrap stock flat on the table and put my plane down on top of it so that just the fence is resting on the scrap. Then I'll push down on the plane to make sure it's flush with the table and re-tighten those screws. Now my plane is set up so that it's the exact width of the stock that I'm going to be rabbeting for. There's no room for error here. Now I need to check the projection of the blade. I've already got a piece of stock set up in my vise, so I'm going to take my rabbet plane, set it with the fence flush against the side of the stock, and give it a gentle push. And in this case, the iron is already engaging and I got a nice little shaving. But it's a pretty light shaving and it's going to be slow going. I'd like the blade to be a little bit deeper. That's no problem. I'm just going to give the chisel a light tap on the back, and that's enough to advance it a little bit. Anytime I mess with the iron, I also want to tap the wedge real quick, just to make sure that stays nice and tight. Last thing I want to check is I need the iron to stick out of the side of the plane, out of the mouth here, just a tiny bit. That's going to give me a square inside corner to my rabbet. And I can tell right here I don't have that stick out that I need. That's easy to fix. I'm just going to tap the side of the chisel, just like that, and you can just feel with your finger until you get the adjustment that you want. That's perfect. Now it's sticking out just a little bit. Now I can see from testing this out that this plane body is a tiny bit thick for this chisel. I might take it apart and take just a couple light shavings off of it with a regular bench plane. For right now it works fine, so I'm not going to worry about it. Now I'll go back to my stock and take another shaving. Good. I'm taking nice shavings. I can see that I've got a good straight line and a nice clean bottom to my rabbet. Let me do several more of these. Now, since this is a short piece of stock, I'm just starting at one end and going all the way across. But rabbet planes aren't typically used that way. Usually you start back a few inches from the far end, push forward, back up a little bit, take a stroke, back up and take a stroke, back up and take a stroke. And this technique lets you progress much more quickly through your rabbet. Now I've got a nice clean rabbet, and I've just watched the depth as I've worked. I could also put a depth stop on the side of this plane really easily. There are lots of examples of those online. I don't really feel like I need a depth stop, so for right now, I'm just going to keep things simple. The rabbet that I've created is the exact same thickness as this piece. And as I set it in here, I can tell that it's a perfect flush fit. If I were going to lap these two boards together, this would already be perfect. If it's going to be the back of a cabinet, my piece of stock still sticks up a little bit, and that just tells me my rabbet needs to be a little deeper. A few more passes with the plane, and this will sit in perfectly flush with the side stock, and I'll be totally done. I think this project is a great example of how you can take stuff that you already have sitting around your shop and make a really useful, functional tool. I own a bunch of different rabbet planes, and honestly, none of them work much better than this one. Some of them have some convenient gadgets, but the rabbets they make are exactly the same, and they take about the same amount of time to use. So there's really no reason not to make one of these if you've got a couple of afternoons and some spare stock. Now with this part of the video, I usually talk about the plans for the project. I have plans for this rabbet plane. They're great and they're inexpensive. But let's make it a little bit more interesting. I've taken 5 of my most popular woodshop plans and put them together into my Toolmakers bundle. And that's available right now for only $8. That's like buying 3 sets of my plans and having me throw in the bench hook, the shooting board, and the rabbet plane for free. So go over to rexkruger.com/store and pick up the 5-plan Toolmakers bundle for only $8. This is a limited time deal. I'm only doing it for the month of September, so grab it before it's gone. And when people look at my plans, they often say, wow, these are really inexpensive. Most of your plans are only $2. And people want to know why that is. Well, it's because of Patreon. The support that I get from Patreon not only allows me to spend days building and shooting and editing these projects, it also allows me to keep prices really low. I sell a few plans, but not nearly enough to support these videos. It's my patrons that make this stuff possible, and their support allows me to keep prices low, even for non-patrons. If you're interested in being a part of that community, go on over to patreon.com/RexKruger and check out the early access, rewards, and exclusive content that I have just for my patrons. And of course, for everybody who's watching this video, thanks so much for watching.